Mr. Rainwater, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you think artists, in particular, have a problem with letting go?
Very good question. I really think it depends on the artist in a lot of situations. And it also depends on what it is that they're letting go of, right?
Well,
Some
specifically their art.
oh, that's timely because for
Um,
me I've had to
yeah,
let go of quite a larger amount of art than I would have wanted to in the this week. And we'll get into that in just a moment, but I'll give you a more substantial answer to that question. Yeah, it is hard. And to go into that further, so this week I actually had to deal with some flooding damage in the house that I've been living in. I've been living with my mom over the course of COVID, and when did this happen? Tuesday. So Tuesday, I was recording my other podcast that I do with my friend Soko, and we did we just kind of were talking a little bit after the podcast, and during the whole time it was raining, just a torrent, just thunder and lightning, the likes of which you wouldn't really expect. But I didn't think much about it. This is kind of weather in Louisiana. It kind of sucks. But meanwhile, my phone is going off with tornado warnings and all kinds of other weather alerts, like flash flood warnings and all that stuff. And I didn't really take it seriously. That kind of thing happens pretty frequently, and you get kind of numb to it over time.
sure.
Well, at a certain point, I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna look outside just to make sure like it's nothing too bad's going on.
Yeah.
And so I look outside, and the backyard is just it's just water. Like it's just there's no grass. There's just water. And so I'm starting to think to myself, okay, this doesn't look good. And I go check out the living room of my mom's house, and it's a pond. There's just water starting to pour in. It's like a sunken living room too, so it's like even more
Oh,
like a pond, And the reality of it starts to dawn on me, and I start to think to myself, okay, I need to probably leave this house because I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if this is going to continue happening. So long story short, I end up, because I was the only one at the house at the time. My mom was at work. My sister, who has also been staying with us, was at work. Or I should say my mom was with my grandmother at the time. But anyway, my mom was my grandmother and my sister was at work. And so I end up bailing the house with my sister's dog, carrying my sister's dog to the Jeep. I try and, salvage whatever I can of like my computer, just stuff that I need
sure.
because I know I'm not going to be in this house for a while. But a lot of the stuff I left behind at the house was art that I've done for, like pages and pages of comics, like at least 1,000 pages.
You're talking like hard copies.
Yes, like when I used to do drawing like pen and ink,
Mm-hmm.
like I would draw a page and then ink over it and then scan those pages, and those would be how I'd get them, up
So you're
for
real
either
life
print.
NFTs.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm on the page
My
now.
real life NFTs. Tons and tons of real life NFTs left in the closet in my room. And in that kind of situation, it's just like, well, it's in God's hands now. There's nothing that can be done at this point. As I was leaving the house, water is slowly starting to creep in, not just from the living room, but from like bathrooms and bedrooms,
Oh my
and
goodness.
getting into my room. And at that point, I'm just like, yeah, it's time to bail. I gotta go. I don't know what happens next. The water's getting up to the higher part of my Jeep, and I'm not really sure how it's going to do in the water.
Yeah.
So, the rain lets up. So I'm like, if there's a time to get out of the situation, now's the time. So I end up going to an aunt and uncle's house in Sulphur, Louisiana, which is just just a couple miles due west of Lake Charles, where I'm currently living. And So I have to, at that point, I'm just kind of like, I'm kind of just going through and letting the adrenaline sort of flush out of my system because that whole thing was like,
Sure. That's not something. That's one of those things where you're in an action movie and you don't realize you're in an action movie,
yes,
and you're just
exactly.
it's like decision to decision to decision, and I don't want to call it a high wire walk, but it almost feels like what you would imagine a high wire walk feels like, where you have to make a decision. Sometimes people are looking at you to make the decision, and you don't know instinctively what is right, but you're gonna take a shot, and that's the shot you're taking. In this case, it was the dog that was with you, but I've been in similar situations like that where I faced flooding and hail at the same time with my wife in the car, and I have a low rise car, and that's the adrenaline pump that you're just going. You're making a decision.
You have no idea what happens next. You don't know if you're going to end up turning down a street where it's like, oh, that street's totally flooded. I don't know which way to go.
It's choose your own adventure in real life.
Exactly.
It's those
You don't
books.
get any extra lives.
Yes.
So
So you lost all of that art in the process, and we decided to talk about this topic for this week because, incidentally, while I was piecing together our last podcast, I had to back up our last episodes to a hard drive so that I could make room on my new computer. And then that hard drive stopped working, which was okay because all of our podcasts were already uploaded and this and that, and there's no real need for a backup. However, I had mistakenly copied or cut and moved source files for our video stuff to that drive as well. So I had to recreate a whole bunch of files in order to get the YouTube version up, which it went a little late last week. I apologize, but it is up now. But it got me thinking because the rest of the stuff that was on that hard drive is also now gone. Projects from when we were in college, stuff that I had shot afterwards, like there's no getting it back. And fortunately for me, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were backed up on a second hard drive because I am anal retentive when it comes to my work. I'm not going to downplay the amount of effort, time, craftsmanship that goes into comics and drawing and things of that nature, but filmmaking is expensive as fuck.
Oh yeah.
And then there's the added nightmare of scheduling where you're not paying people, so you have to work around a whole bunch of different schedules to make things work correctly, and that's aggravating beyond belief. So when I say I backed up footage, I mean I think I have it on like 3 or 4 hard drives, and one of them went down. So thankfully, I won't have as much loss as you did, but it did get us talking about the thing, and this is what I was thinking about this afternoon, which is what I wanted to go into, which was I've noticed the habit with artists is we have a hard time letting go. Like even when you look at like movies, it's called a release date. It's not called a premiere date necessarily. It's called a release date because the powers that be, that whoever funding a project, take it away. Like and they give it to the audience. Like it's no longer yours. And it's the dread of every single artist, the deadline. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. And I'm curious to know why we tend to feel this way. Why it's almost like our art becomes a child or a best friend or something like that. Like we put so much of ourselves into it, but then we don't want to let it go. It's weird.
I mean, I definitely say that over time, I have started to look at different projects like children, and in the same respect of like, I kind of treat different projects with different degrees of like.
You have a favorite child.
Yeah, I definitely do, and it's usually the one that I'm spending the most time on at any given point.
That's fair.
There's still there's still projects that I've worked on for a long time that I had to let go for all sorts of different reasons. And I've had projects that I've lost on hard drives. And it's interesting because for me, the loss of like physical art hits deeper than the loss of stuff that's only exclusively digital. And if I were, I guess the best way I would describe it as, I realized I had lost some art on like an old computer, and the computer went when the computer died, and my only backup was on a hard drive disk. So like hard drive disks wear out over time
Sure.
on like SSDs that tend to last longer. So the hard drive, like the external hard drive disks, went bad eventually, and so I lost like, projects that went back to college, projects that went back to a little after college, stuff that I had worked on for fun or for whatever reason. But for the way that went was, it was like I realized it after the fact. Whereas when I was like carrying this wet, like soaked art, and I could still kind of make out the drawings and stuff, that hit harder because it was like the tangibility of it. And
It's like watching someone die.
Yeah, like I remember all the hours of myself sitting at the table working on those pages and all that stuff. It had the physicality sort of hit deeper for me. Not that changes anything for anybody who's like, feeling the loss of their digital, art.
Yeah.
But going back to your original question, yeah, I mean, there's definitely the attitude that I feel towards my art is to they're my spawn, like in some way I'm responsible for them,
And then
I'm responsible for their fate.
I think it goes a step beyond that, because for me, when I'm creating something, in the very back of my mind, this isn't what is always in the forefront of my mind, but it does jump there occasionally. But in the back of my mind, I'm always trying to remember, or at least I think, this art is going to outlive me. Someone, like I can be dead for 30 years and my great grandson or something like that could find a script written by me and be like, wow, like my great granddad wrote this, like that, you know what I mean? And it's almost like when you lose that, when it doesn't exist anymore, it's like, oh, that piece of me that I thought was going to live past me, far past me, died before I did. You know what I mean? Like, because that's part of the reason why as artists we do art, is we're snapping a photo or an idea and putting it into a physical state, even considerably digital, another state that is not human, I guess is the way to say, so that it can live past us. So when we watch it die, you know what I mean? And I think that's part of the reason why we get so torn up when we have to let it go too, because it's just like a kid. It's like, it's out of my hands now. It could die and I can't protect it anymore. You know what I mean? Like if my house burns down, knock on wood, then all 3 of those hard drives I was talking about that were backups are gone. Like that's it. It's not in a cloud drive anymore. It's too much space for that.
I know that's like, I mean, this whole flood thing that ended up happening was something that was in the back of my mind, ever since I was living in my mom's house. But like, I kind of put it to the side and it's like, well, it'll probably be fine. And then the day comes, right? And there's only so many things that you can do to protect the safety and security of your artwork. I mean, I've thought about, one of the advantages of the internet and distributing art online digitally is that you can, at least in theory, better ensure the survivability of your work, because it's not just like on your server, but if you can get it on other people's servers, and let it multiply and spread and whatever, so long as you're willing to deal with like sort of there's a cost, right? It's there's sort of a cost.
It's a depreciative value to it, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
And that's the catch-22, because you want it to mean something, you want it to be worth something, but the safer it is, the less it's worth, I guess, is the philosophical end that I'm kind of reaching at is that, like, you know what I mean? As well protected as it is, it loses its worth. I think the worth comes from the inherent risk of, and I like that's kind of the point of the NFT, right? Is to minimize the not safety of it, but the amount of it, which ups its worth. Yes. So I don't know why though, but like I want to. I struggle with the idea. It's almost like the first time you put out a new piece of art. It's that fear of, oh, will this get lost? Will no one hear this? Will no, you know what I mean? Like if you put out something and it just goes ignored, is that worse than losing it? Because they're on the same wavelength.
That's a really good question. I guess my first response to that, or my most impulsive response to that, was something to the effect of, that's why lately I've been trying to sort of approach it more in regards to thinking about it as the process instead of the final product. Like, okay. Whatever happens to it after it's produced is no longer in my hands, because I can't define how it's going to be received by the audience.
Yep.
I can't define how whether I even make it to their eyes. You know what I mean? You can't. There's nothing you can do to ensure that happens. There's plenty of work that I've made that maybe 5 to 10 people have seen, and then either they've seen it and just kind of like went over their head or whatever, or it just never really got in front of anybody. And that, I think that's a reality that most artists deal with at some point or another, where they, in really truly, like going into the sort of the history of art, most paintings, most art, even the most epic art, for long periods of time were only viewed by a very small group of people. I mean, even the pyramids, like even the statuary that's in Giza was only seen by people who actually visited Egypt, and not that many people like traveled that often.
Right. It was a lot more detrimental at that point in time.
For the people who built that stuff, like, they never really got to see the fruits of their labor, in the sense of having somebody come up to you and be like, "Oh, I can't believe that you made this," like some random stranger. Probably not as much anyway as today, as like, what's his name, Beeple, making an NFT and millions of people are, their hearts are changed or whatever.
Yeah.
That's something that is definitely, I think, newer to the last 100 years of art. Maybe a little bit more than 100 years, but I would say that 150 years of art, that's a new thing.
Right. The stuff is like so much more accessible.
Yes. The idea of the celebrity artist is kind of a new phenomenon. And so I've been kind of thinking about that and trying to remind myself of that when I'm with whatever I'm creating, because I want to have the perspective of, look, I mean, even if I'm not the most popular artist, I'm still more popular than Van Gogh was at his time. You know what I mean? True. Which is crazy to think about, because, like, for me, like,
you're
Van Gogh
so egotistical.
It's like Van Gogh at his time. Like, I love Van Gogh as an artist, and he's somebody who, like, inspired me towards painting when I was a kid. And it's incredible to think that there was only a handful of people who even knew who he was during his lifetime. And then everything else afterward happened during or posthumously, know? And so,
which sucks.
It
really does suck if you think about it, because like there are so many artists even now that are pumping out stuff and they won't get appreciated until someone finds it. Like, I'm sure that there is probably some person out on SoundCloud or DeviantArt or something that has put out amazing stuff, and just the right person with the right amount of followers on Twitter hasn't found it yet. And that person passed away from COVID or a heart attack or took their own life or something to that extent. And one I don't want to call them gatekeepers, but one person, one distribution platform has to stumble upon them. It's like a lightning strike. And all of a sudden, you're a great artist. And it's like, no, they were a great artist before that. It's just you, the audience, are only now aware of them. And I think that's a humbling thing that artists need to start keeping in mind, because I think we're all very hard on ourselves about, like you have almost 100,000 followers for Trailer Park Warlock, correct? And I'm sure that even in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, if I can get to 150 by the end of next year or something like you know what I mean? Like there's always that next goal. Like we almost are never satisfied. And that is both an attribute and a curse at the same exact time. It's a double-edged sword, because you know what I mean? Like we want to keep striving further, but we also need to take that moment to remind ourselves why we do this, and that success is what's the word I'm looking for here?
Fleeting.
It's fleeting, but it's also objectionable, or
when you say
subjective. Subjective.
Oh, okay.
That's what I mean to say.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because there are people who have sold millions of records, like gone double platinum or whatever like that, and they still are like don't think that they've quote unquote made it. Like the rest of us are like, excuse me? Like you're on top 40 radio for 2 years straight. You have millions of dollars. You have made it. And it's like, no, they have their own standard about where they want to be, and they don't feel like they've obtained it yet. And then there's imposter syndrome that's a bitch that I know that we all deal with on every day. But something struck me, and it was actually something that you had told me when we were talking about in our the budget versus the egg podcast about Picasso charging, I think it was Picasso, you said, charged like an astronomical amount for a napkin sketch. Yeah. And I guess the thing that I've been trying to look at my stuff with now is that even when I lose something, it was part of the building blocks that are taking me where I'm going. Kind of like how Picasso was like, oh, that napkin sketch is $1 million. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, you're paying for all of the art that I've done before this that's made me better to be able to do this amazing sketch of you on a napkin. So even when that stuff is lost, you kind of have to write it off. You know what I mean? As
it is ultimately a cost expenditure.
Yeah.
For your later art, right?
Right.
Even the stuff that you produce that like even meets the goals that you want, gets the accolades or makes the money or whatever, like that's still a stepping stone to the next thing.
Yeah.
And if the next thing doesn't even meet those goals, so long as you're like making art that was better than what you made subjectively for yourself, better than what you made previously, to me, that's what I guess that's how I try to look at it. You know, like Absolutely. For me, like I can still look right now at Trailer Park Warlock and go, okay, I'm still taking all of the valuable lessons that I learned with all those pages that I lost, right? Like the pages are gone, but the skill is still there. The skill I've still acquired, right? And this goes into an idea of wealth that I've been trying to focus more on, which is the idea that wealth is not so much the money that you have stored, it's the information that you've gained, it's the knowledge that you have, it's the network of friends that you have and stuff like that, because all those things have exponential possibilities. The more knowledge that you accrue, the more degrees of freedom that you have. There's more that you can do even when you have less, because if you have the knowledge about how you can, raise the funds to make a new project, you don't have to have the initial funds previously. That helps. It always helps, right?
Absolutely.
But with the knowledge of how to do it better than you did previously, you can do it faster. You can do it on a tighter budget, and you can do it more effectively or more proficiently. And that's all stuff that it comes with time and it comes with experience. And it kind of makes me think about, this other idea that I have kind of, which is that sometimes I think about art as, I'd use this metaphor in talking about Twitter the other night after the podcast with you and me and Matt and Joe, where I was talking about My issue with social media is that, it's a very low res way of interacting with people, right? And you're kind of just all the sentences and stuff you find are kind of just like the excretion that people left behind, like
Yeah.
their mind crap. And in some ways, art is kind of like that in the sense that these are the excretions of your brain that you've left along for other people to find. And for whatever reason, humans are the kind of animals where we like find the excretions of other people's brains and go, oh, that looks really cool. I think I want like buy that or put it up on my wall. And like, so going back to Van Gogh, like that's exactly how I think Van Gogh sort of thought about painting, was that I'm involved with this in the act of painting. The actual painting itself is not as important to me as the process that I'm in the moment. Because I'm trying to show the process more than I'm trying to like make a finished final painting. And he was still concerned about that, but there's
You're talking about like executing the skill.
yes, but also just like the going kind of back to last week's topic of that play mindset, right? Like when you're doodling, when you're just making something and you're 100% involved and you're not thinking about it and you're just doing it. That
Intuitively, yeah.
Yes, that experience of making the piece is oftentimes, or can often be the time I'm sorry, let me start over here. That experience of making the piece is oftentimes the thing that artists are reaching for.
That is the thing of value. Not the canvas with the oil paint on it. It is the experience of executing the techniques, of transmitting a thought from your brain to your hand into the pen onto the page. Like that skill set. It's almost like, I don't want to call it practice, but like, a pitcher is trying to throw a curveball, a fastball, an off-speed pitch. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to do these different things, and once you get there, like the muscle memory of it's unlike unlocking a video game. That's basically what it is. You know what I mean? Because then you can play that level again, and that's what I was kind of thinking about too. About there's another benefit to when you lose something, like a piece or something that maybe hasn't been seen by the world, is now you are able to cut off the fat. Like you can look at a piece that you've done and be like, yeah, I did really great job on the eyebrows and the way that the brow meets with the eyes right there, but his hands look all funky. And I always hated how the hands looked on that. Now it's like, oh, now I have an opportunity to redraw that, and I can make sure that I can still do the brow the way that I did it, and then I can also take another shot at those hands. And maybe that's going to work this time, and because it's, I don't want to call it fresh or new because you're redoing something that you've already done, but you have the right to reshare it. You know what I mean? It's like, you can go on Instagram and be like, hey, I did this a couple years ago. It didn't get a lot of traction. I lost it in a fire. Now I gave it another shot, and this is what it looks like. And then now you've got 600 followers as opposed to the 12 you had back then, and all of a sudden, boom. There, you know what I mean? Like that was the one that quote unquote made it. And
another example that comes to my mind too is, we may have talked about this in the past, but I had a computer that I worked on for a while that, for whatever reason, the backup battery did not work very well. So it would just, without warning, just cut out if it was in low battery mode. So I lost at least 10 or so hours of work on that thing overall. You know what I mean? And so I got into the habit of, Control S, like as in, like it's now like just I'm not even thinking about it when I'm doing it. It's totally an impulsive, just like
it's like
Control
blinking.
Every 15 minutes or so. But I would definitely have these moments when that would happen. I mean, the first reaction is, oh shit, and then the second reaction is, I won't be able to draw that panel again. Like, I can't do it exactly how it was previously. It's totally lost to time.
Yeah.
It's totally just gone. And over time, what I would do is just go, okay, well, this is my opportunity to do it even better then. What did I not think about when I was originally drawing that shot? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how could I do that shot better? Where could I, and it ended up actually a couple of times leading to slight alterations in the plot, like in good ways,
Sure.
And that's sort of like a happy accident sort of mindset, which you really have to brute force your way into. Quite frankly, it's not something that you can just like do. It takes a lot of exercise to just be able to like force yourself to smile through it and be like, we'll make it better.
But that's, I mean, in a way, losing your art is akin to failing with it, and in a way. Yep. Do you know what I mean? Like, because like I'm thinking about when you're talking this, I'm thinking about my first draft for Haunted. When I had a nightmare, and it was me on the back of a haunted hayride, and I remember someone saying to me in the dream, as there was a guy with a chainsaw, looked like Leatherface, pulling somebody over the side, and they're screaming for help, and I was freaking out. And the guy next to me on the hayride goes, "Oh, don't worry about it. They use plants." And then I woke up, and I remember thinking to myself, Jesus, that was a brilliant idea. Why wouldn't a haunted Halloween haunt or whatever like that put actors in the tour with you to be killed off? That would make it so much more immersive. Watched a bunch of movies. None of them had done it yet. And I'm thinking, that's it. This is a great idea. Knocked out that first draft in like a night. It might have taken me a weekend to write that script. Yeah. Sent it off to a bunch of film festivals. Nothing. Got rejected from every single one of them. Didn't place, didn't even be qualified, none of it. And I thought it was one of those moments where it was like, oh, maybe this idea wasn't that great. And I stopped and I kind of regrouped and I thought, no, that idea still has merit. I fucked up. Let me reread my script. And that's when I reread it and I was like, Jesus, this is shit. And that was an opportunity for me to revisit it. And I was like, and the bright side of it was I was able to look at it. That was the beautiful thing, was I still had it in front of me, and I could say, I see where I fucked up. I can change this. I can move that there. I can do this better. I can remove this because that's not really necessary. It doesn't lead to anything. Like, I could start cleaning things up. It's that old adage, hindsight is 20/20, and sometimes especially when you have it still in front of you, you have that opportunity. So even when you fail, you can go back and redo it. And sometimes I guess when you lose it, it's actually a thing because you don't get distracted by trying to copy exactly like how you said, those exact lines and everything like that. You're much more focused on the execution of, can I get this? Can I get myself to the place where I feel the same way about it that I did before or better? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that, like you don't get distracted by the whole, can I cop? You're not Gus Van Santing Psycho. You're trying to trying to recapture what you had without trying to copy it, if that makes any sense.
That definitely makes sense to me. And I definitely, I mean, going back to sort of physical art, because there is, for me personally, there is this weird dichotomy between digital and physical art, where with digital art, I don't feel as close or as bonded to it in the same way as, like, if I make a watercolor painting, even if it's the shittiest watercolor painting, I still feel like there's a certain amount of like
ownership.
Ownership. I feel bonded to it in this different way than I do with digital art, and it's definitely a tactile thing. Like, because using like a brush, there's just like it's a different kind of connection with medium. And
because it's the NFT thing again. There's only one of them. There's only one hard copy. I mean, you can digitize it, like you said, but there's only that one hard copy. And even if you take it and Xerox it, like if you painted it, it's not going to have that texture when you run your fingers over it. It's not going to have.
It's the same thing like with Polaroids too, where it's like Polaroids. It's very hard to make. I'm sure there are ways to do it, but it's very hard to make duplicates of Polaroids because they're very much like the idea was designed to be this impromptu, in the moment sort of thing. So, a lot of people who had Polaroids ended up having all these encoded moments in time that were impossible to repeat. Just like,
Yep.
and going into a deeper philosophical level of it, there is an aspect, at least from my perspective, there's an aspect of life that's very like transient, and that means like things pass. Even the most eventually mountains get wound down by time, canyons are built, things change, and with change comes loss. And a lot of art, I guess we can get into sort of thematics now, is like a lot of art is built around dealing with that loss in some way. Sometimes we try and deal with that loss by making stuff that is very difficult to lose. Things like statues, or bronze, or sculptures, or buildings. We want to make stuff that in our imagination will stand the test of time, even though ultimately the way of the universe is nothing does, right?
Yeah.
So something, if the wind doesn't take care of it, or if an earthquake doesn't take care of it, the fucking sun will take care of it eventually.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting way in which humans attempt to achieve immortality. Like you were kind of talking about earlier, it's the same way. It's a similar idea that goes into, reproduction, into having children. You want to carry on some part of you, some way, somehow. You want to carry on some part of you into time, so that you're not completely lost. Because everybody dies, right? We all. Unless physics and biology changes that in the near future, who knows? Like, maybe my brain can become an NFT and they can pass it around on the internet. But anyway, I should get off this ramble a little bit and ask you, for yourself, like, how do you view sort of that idea of transience in the world, in regards, not even just in regards to art, but like also sort of just the emotional, deeper level of it?
Can you define transience for me?
Yeah, just like how things change, things pass, people die, like even like Star Wars, right? Like, can we even find the original film? Is it gone to time?
That's something that I've struggled with in the past, because I was not for a vast majority of my life, and I'm only coming up on 35 now, but for the vast majority of my 35 years, I've been a very controlling and, dare I say, conservative, but but I don't mean necessarily in the political sense. I mean more so in just like I don't like things that change. Do you know what I mean? Like when I was a teenager, I didn't like when my friends started doing this or doing that. And then I started to kind of grasp the concept that without change, life is boring. And that's really what starts becoming the thing that enters my head. So when I'm working on something, if I'm working on it for too long, I realize not only am I boring, my audience is bored, the art is probably getting boring, and the original intention gets lost. Because the first thing that I like, my number one intention always is to provide some level of escapism to my audience. Doesn't matter what format I'm doing it, whether it's the script or the movie or a poster. When I'm doing it, I want to take a second of your life and enrich it with something that you're not finding elsewhere. And when you become obsessive about things remaining the same, that's when life gets dull. That's the complete opposite of what I'm trying to provide, and I become my own worst enemy. So I've, in recent years, started really embracing the idea that things change, people change, relationships change, movies change, franchises change, the whole nine yards. Like, and you got to be accepting with it. You don't have to love all of it. Like there's some people who out there just love every movie, and I'm just like, no, you got to have some standards. But at the same time, I mean, you gotta be able to look at things and say, like, there's tons of horror fans who are like, oh, they don't make them like they did in the 80s, and that's true, they don't. But that doesn't necessarily devalue horror movies from modern day. There are still quite a few gems that come out in modern era times that are instant classics in my mind. And then on the other part of me, I hear that and I'm like, yeah, they don't make horror movies like they do in the 80s. Fuck it. Why don't I make a horror movie like they did in the 80s? Like, there's nothing restricting me. It's not like I'm saying, man, they don't make them like they did in 2070. Well, I don't have the tech and the kind of stuff in the future. I don't know what the fuck's coming. But I do know what there's in the past. And I have an eBay account. I can get a film camera and some film. I can get it developed. I can make a prosthetic werewolf face. Like, it's not hard to replicate that kind of thing. So as an artist, it's like it's a challenge. It's like, okay, if I want to regress, why don't I regress? Like, that's interesting. Like, that's, do you know what I mean? Like, that is still change. It's a change in a different direction, but it's still change. And that's the number one thing that I think artists need to kind of grasp is you shouldn't be looking at what everyone is doing. That's one of the reasons why I love Kanye West. He's a fucking space case, and I love him because I think, like, a lot of times when I see him rambling and this and that, I think a lot like how he thinks a lot of times, and I'm like, wow, like someone who's an absolute bona fide genius. Everybody thinks he's crazy. But his art speaks for itself. He is always the guy setting the trend right now. And it doesn't matter if he does a throwback to 70s soul or if he just creates something new. Like, he's constantly innovating or progressing or regressing. He's never in a stagnant state. So the idea to me
I definitely appreciate that about him. But go on, Joe.
But the going back to your original question, the idea of letting go and transgressing and moving and stuff like that, to me, is what art is all about. And a lot of people get caught up about moving forward. They don't necessarily think that sometimes moving backward can be a great thing. You see nowadays in film, and I mean film, like movies, people are using film more than they have in the last 10, 15 years because there was this whole big push for digital because it was cheaper. But then Christopher Nolan came along and he's like, no, I'm going to shoot on film. And you know, you got a bunch of other indie directors who, yeah, maybe there's a kind of a hipster mentality towards it, but there is science, like visual science, to back up the film superiority over digital. It's not going to last forever. But there is something tangible there that adds something different to that experience. And that variety is what sparks soul. Like, does anybody want to watch the same movie 5 million times? I mean, granted, I did with Batman Begins, but every now and then I want to throw on something else. I want to throw on Wedding Crashers. I want to throw on, you know, a stupid trauma film or something. You know what I mean? Like, I can't watch the same thing all the time. I got to watch something new and different, and it's got to change. That's the key to making art. And to end my rant, I think that's the big thing that artists need to understand is that if you want to stand out, you got to risk that change and you have to lose everything you've built. I brought this up during our original podcast with Joe Bevel about Donald Glover, Childish Gambino. His first album was everything I wanted it to be. It was so great. It was a great hip-hop album. His second album, I had preconceived expectations about what it was going to be, but he completely changed his style. 100% not what I was expecting, and I did not vibe with it at the beginning. It was not what I wanted. It was not what I thought it should have been. And then I go back and I listen to the songs now, and I'm like, yeah, this is different. I'm glad he did this. I'm glad it's different. I'm glad he didn't repeat himself. I'm glad he cut off and lost that part of him that made that first album, and it was a completely different him that made that next thing. So it's like, if you're not cutting off, like when we do art, even you, I'm sure you use the eraser tool, right?
Yeah, right.
I have, swapped out different takes in a scene and this and that. it's the idea of editing. And if we as artists don't edit ourselves, then we're not growing.
Yeah, I really like that analogy that you're going with, because that really brings to light a very important aspect of being an artist is, and not necessarily everybody does this. It's something that I certainly aspire towards it, but like making my life a form of art as well, where I am living my life in such a way that somebody who might look at it in the future might view it, as this sort of experiment or a sort of like attempt to describe something deeper, or whatever. Like they get some impact from the story of my life or the story of somebody else's
Right.
the story of somebody else's life. And that's certainly like the sense I get from, some of my favorite artists. Like I feel that way about David Bowie, where it's like there's a guy who kept changing. It's interesting because I think of Kanye West as sort of our modern day David Bowie, in that he's very much, both of them are very much interested into the idea of like changing and sort of taking the zeitgeist of the moment and putting it out there from their perspective or from their filter.
Yeah.
And the world is always going to change, right? And that can make it very easy for an artist to change. All they have to do is sort of pay attention to what's going on in the world and then, lasso onto it and just go for the ride. It's a lot harder to more intentionally force yourself to change, right? And sometimes that has to happen, and then sometimes it happens without your input at all, right? Like for myself, I'm kind of going through a certain amount of life change with all this stuff with the flood, right? It's certainly changed my attitudes about where I'm going to live in the future, which is going to impact me in some way, big or small, right? Sure. It's changed a lot of my thought about trying to hold on to everything because, a lot of the stuff that was lost is stuff from my childhood, like a VHS copy of Land Before Time that I know that I watched religiously as a child. Right. And I never watched it at all after probably the age of 7 or 8, but having it there for so long was like this thing that in my mind, it needed to be there. Well, now it's not there anymore. Now it's gone. And that's something that as I get used to, I start thinking about, okay, well, so what can I do now, right? Where do I go to now? Where do I pivot? Sort of going in the direction of what you were talking about and I think this is why most artists really struggle with letting go of stuff, is because it's the fear of where do I go next? If I don't have this stable place that I've been hanging out in where I know that it'll hit the right notes for me, or I'll feel happy or make other people happy doing this, like why would I leave here if this is doing everything that I need? Why would I take the chance of going somewhere else where like I don't know what the fuck's gonna happen?
Right.
Like after Trailer Park Warlock, if I'm just like fuck it, I'm completely an NFT artist. I'm never making comics again. I'm just making 3D sculptures of people's buttholes. Like that's,
But
like
you're absolutely right though. Like that, and I think that's the thing. A lot of artists we crave moving forward, but we fear it. It's that again, a double-edged sword where we want to change, but we're afraid to change. And it's not something I think a lot of normal people go through. They have the stepping stones that they, are laid out for them. It's like, oh, go to school, get a good job, get married, have a kid, have grandkids, die. And like, as long as they're hitting those beats in their story structure, they feel comfortable. Whereas an artist could feel, I don't know if I'm going to get married. I don't know if I'm going to have kids. I don't know if I want to, do this or do that or whatever. And then they could also be like me, where it's like, okay, I got married. I had a kid. And part of me still wants to do crazy stuff. I want to jump out of a plane. I want to do this. I want to do that. And it's like, I have to figure out to self-edit and figure out what's going to best inform me as the art, like how you were talking about making yourself a piece of art. And that's the real thing that a lot of artists are afraid to do. And I think they're robbing themselves, because what is art if not the reinterpretation of real world experiences through another medium? Everything that a lot of us are, we talked about this last week with the instinct thing. We are built up of our experiences, right? And that's what the instinct really informs. And so if you're not really living your life, you're not really putting yourself in the best position to create new art. That's kind of how I've been approaching life these days. Is like, if I'm scared out of my mind with something, I'm in the right place. There was one point when, there's a pizza place that, I ate from my entire childhood because my parents always ordered from there, and they drove and paid and picked up for it. And I had to start going there once I started living on my own, and I realized I didn't know the streets around there, and I didn't know how to get home from there. And like, going to pick up a pizza, I don't want to call it traumatizing, but it was a nerve-wracking experience, because I was like, is this a one-way street? Is this going to take me here? Is this going to take me to a bad part of town? And it was one of those things that you just had to do. So now I'm at the point where I am dying. I'm dying to get into the point of pre-production where I can make a cold call. That was one of the things that I absolutely dreaded for my entire life. And right now I'm kind of thirsting for the idea of making a cold call to some random, like a horse and carriage place, to say, hey, I'm shooting a movie and I need a horse and carriage, but I also need it to be a hearse. And do you have black horses? How much would that cost? Do you have availability? Could we do all night? Like that kind of stuff, I'm thirsting for it right now, because that's a new experience to me. And if I stop doing that stuff, I'm going to get bored and I'm going to get depressed. That's the long of the hard, heavy truth that I realized when I came out of my depression was, being safe is the worst way to live. It really is, especially for an artist. If you feel comfortable, take it in for a breath, maybe two, because something, you should relax and celebrate and take a minute to just kind of, let your body catch up to where your mind has been. But when you get back to it, man, you gotta go skydiving. You gotta let the snake, hold a snake in your hand. You gotta do all that kind of crazy stuff to feel alive. Because then you're going to be thinking about that one day when you're writing a story. You're like, I remember that day that I held a snake in my hand. And now I'm writing a scene where a guy is surrounded by snakes. And I remember I had this thought. It's a thought that you'd only have if you were really surrounded by snakes. And that's going to be that's going to be a random thought that some screenwriter who wrote an Indiana Jones movie, that they never been around a snake, they're just going to go, oh, snakes, okay. Tss, like a guy throws a stick at them and that's it. But a guy who's actually been near a snake is just going to be like, some other avenue that's going to be make an audience go, wow, that's really great. And that's what's drawing people into your story or your art, is that you are an observer with the opportunity to communicate feelings, emotions, experiences, whatever it may be, that the normal people that play it by the beats, paint by numbers, don't. And that's when you find value as an artist. You are living the life that everyone else wishes they could.
It definitely goes into something that we've talked about on several podcasts, and something I always like to bring up, which is that for artists, lived experience is one of the most fertile places to pull from for making your work, making your art. I know that the experience that I went through this week, and even going through right now, is going to filter into is probably going to filter into Trailer Park Warlock in some way.
There's going to be an Empire Strikes Back kind of downbeat ending to the next season or something like that. But that's what's great. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because when when the feeling is no longer abstract, it's like a memory. It's even better. It's a traumatic memory, right? So you can you have something very solid that you can put to paper. That isn't just it isn't just your imagination, and not to
Right.
not to poo-poo the imagination or whatever. I love the imagination, but since we're all working on our shit, sometimes you accrue shit that happens that you need to work out, and sometimes you just have to kind of like have the mindset of making the most of it, right?
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, like what can you do? Like I don't want to just hang on to this, terrifying experience and then have it just there and never like make more of it, make something out of it in my life where it's like, yeah, I had this bad experience, but then I used it in a story and it actually like was pretty impactful for me overall. You know what I mean? So would you, Jao, would you have any other advice to writers or artists in regards to how to use like lived experience in a story? Like maybe we can go a little more direct into that, because right now we're sort of on the abstract, we're skirting around the topic, but I was thinking like maybe we could spend this moment to sort of talk about how to notate, I guess, our lives in a way in art.
To be brutally honest, what you need to do is understand why you're not going to be the only person who's gone through a lived experience. Like throughout humanity, these things echo. You know what I mean? They rhyme. They come in and out of everybody's life. It's a universal thing. But you have the opportunity as a storyteller to fill it with meaning. Like most people complain that their lives don't really have that much meaning and that movies and, fiction are bullshit because they always find some kind of silver lining or whatever. But that is why the audience is coming to you. We are the shamans. We are the wise men of lived experiences. That's the kind of thing. And it's our job to not so much look on the bright side. It's not always about finding the good. It's about finding the meaning. The meaning can be can be interpreted as good, or it can be a warning signal. You know what I mean? Like it can be like the point is you are providing that experience. This is one of the reasons why I love horror movies, is because you go through a traumatic experience of death and loss and all like the crazy adrenaline filled scenarios from the safety of your couch. And at the end of it, you feel a little bit braver than when you went in. And you know what I mean? Like when I got depressed, when I say got, I mean, when I get depressed, I put on Shawshank Redemption, and that movie works me through my shit. I have never been to prison. I have never been, accused of murdering my wife. Knock on wood. I don't live in the 1940s. Like none of those things are part of my life experience, but I've had that feeling of despair, and somehow Frank Darabont and Stephen King were able to mesh into one story that interprets despair into the into a question. It's a proposal, and they say it in the movie: get busy living or get busy dying, which is, okay, you're in this state of despair. What are you going to do with it? And that's the question proposed to the audience. They don't say that despair is good. They don't say that it's bad. They don't say anything. All they say is, what are you going to do with it? They ask a question. That is what the artist does. They ask a simple question to the audience. And when I watch that movie, I see a character make a decision, says, I'm not going to be trapped here. I'm going to free myself from despair, which is in the figuratively sense, or the physical representation of that is the prison. And he frees himself. He goes through literally a 3 football field length tunnel of shit to get there. And it's all a beautiful analogy. It's symbolism of the things you have to do to get where you want to be. But all it starts with is a simple question. What are you going to do? And I asked myself that when the movie is over. It's like, okay, life sucks right now. So what can I do about it? And that's all it needs to do. It doesn't need to tell me, you can do it. Go, Andrew, get up. No. All it has to do is ask me the simple question. What are you going to do? Because it's up to me. So as an artist, when you go through those experiences, yes, you are allowed to be human. You are allowed to grieve, to mourn, to feel loss, to have self-pity and sympathy for, your situation and everything like that. But at some point you need to step back and you need to evaluate it objectively and just be like, how can I use this? Because I'm not the only person that's going to go through this or has gone through this or whatever.
Yeah.
So like when I look at things now, when I'm writing a story, I like to look at it as maybe I get hit by a Mack truck tomorrow, but they make Indom, and then one day my son got depressed and he watches Indom, and it's me talking to my son through that script, through that story, and he gets something from that gets him out of that depression. And that's how I have to look at it. So it's not so much about being preachy. It's about understanding why your audience comes to your art. They escape, but they're also looking for something. Everybody is. When you go to any kind of medium, when you go look at a painting, why do people look at paintings? Why? Because we want to see a window into something that we haven't seen. So like that's why a lot of people get bored when they look at art history stuff, because it's like, oh, it all looks the same. But then you look at Dante's Inferno and you're like, holy shit, like what the fuck's going on here? And then like, you know what I mean? Like you're looking at all the detail and everything, and you're just like, wow, that's something. And that's the one that stands out. That's the one that speaks to you. And I think as an artist, you just have to understand why the audience comes to you. Again, why they come to you, and what your role is as the artist. The artist and the audience have a relationship. So if you understand what your role is, you need to figure out how you're going to play it. And that's how I would say. What would you say that an artist should do in terms of actionable stuff with their life experiences? Because I've rambled for about 10 minutes now, so it's your turn.
No, I mean, I would relate to it pretty similar to what you're saying. Although I'll use the story. I've talked about this story on the podcast before, but the book Jerusalem has had a pretty considerable impact on me in the sense of thinking about life as a historical process, and thinking about the overall history of the earth, of humanity. And so it gives me perspective to think of myself as this small player in a much larger act, right? Because the story of Jerusalem, to go into that actual topic, is about a town. It is about a town called Northampton. It's in the United Kingdom, and it's more about the town than it is about the people. But each chapter is from the perspective of a different person who lived in Northampton at different periods of time. So you can go. The story goes as far back as during times of Roman occupation, which was like, I couldn't even give you a proper year date, but maybe like 300 AD or before then, to all the way to 2000 and 2016. And so when you get to see people's lives spread out in this one area, right, over the course of time, you get to see just how much things change, just how much stays the same too in terms of human psychology.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get it. The feeling that I always got from reading that book was this feeling of, even when I don't feel like my life matters, it does matter, because it leads up to somebody else's life. And it impacts the people around me. It impacts the environment that I live in, no matter how big or how small. And for myself, like, what I'm saying, I feel like is just a modification, really, of your statement, which was that I think of the artist as somebody who offers a set of binoculars to somebody, or a microscope, or some tool to say, hey, you may have been looking at life this way for this long, but have you tried looking at it this way? See, have you tried looking at the world from a perspective of, like, into the future, into the past? Or what if you were just removed from, like, the third dimension entirely, which is something that happens in Jerusalem. And I will say, like, just to kind of digress a little bit, it's one of the few books I've read that's like actually tried to describe what it would be like to look at time from like a four-dimensional perspective.
Wow.
Like much better than Interstellar tries to do it, but like it describes looking at time in a way that I've never thought of before, where it almost feels like mathematical, like, oh, this actually really makes sense. And it ends up turning into like this very matter of factual way of describing what it would be like to be a ghost, which is
Wow.
one of the weirdest things I've ever read in a story. And anyway, that shift in perspective allows me to sort of think in regards to my own lived experience, and it allows me to not be too too concrete in my day-to-day experience.
I was gonna say, it sounds like you're trying to say like you can detach yourself from your own experience.
It gives me a second to like shift.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
To say like, yes, this is my life right now, but like, what was this house like 60 years ago? Or like, what was this land like 100 years ago? This house wasn't here 100 years ago. This was something else. This was a forest. This was whatever, Yeah. Go back a million years ago. Who knows what the hell it was?
It's crazy to think like, I do think like that occasionally. Sometimes I'll be sitting somewhere and I'll be like, there's a chance a T-Rex walked right where I was standing. Like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of crazy thought enters my mind. Or sometimes I'll be like, there could be a ghost that, died here 6 months ago and I would never even know it. Or the aliens walked here, or it's just, you know what I mean? Like somebody got abducted here. Like I absolutely can look at it that way. That's where the imagination comes back into play. But
right.
yeah, I understand what you're saying. But see, that's the important thing, is that you are saying it through that different lenses, because that's how two artists interpret things differently. And that's why I don't want to say some artists excel, but more people can identify with one particular artist and some people will identify with another artist. And sometimes we measure things incorrectly. We say, oh, somebody went and saw this artist's movie and there's 100 million people that went and saw that movie and 12 people went and saw that movie. I don't think that negates the 12-person movie. I think that it just means that those 12 people feel drawn to that particular artist, and that's their community, that's their clique. Like, people see things differently, and those 12 people see it the way that one artist saw it, and the other millions. Now, from a business standpoint, of course, they're going to shift towards the person who had 1 million eyeballs on their thing. Right. But that to me is as we're learning with the crypto market right now, money is bullshit. Like, that's just value is very transient, right?
Right. It shifts from hand to hand, and you can't quite ever predict like how it's going to shift. And I wanted to just tie in, because I digressed a little bit when I was talking about Jerusalem. I wanted to tie in to the original statement about, or the original question about, in regards to direct experience. So ultimately, the book Jerusalem, the direct experience that goes into it is Alan Moore has lived. He's the writer of the book. Alan Moore has lived in Northampton basically all of his life, which is why he chose that as the subject for the book. And as I read the book, it became apparent to me that this book was him learning about the history of this town that he lived in and making a semi autobiographical story out of it, because it involves a character who's very much a stand-in for him. It involves characters who are stand-ins for his family. And so he basically ends up making this really like ambitious sort of family history to a certain extent. And that had a lot of that meta level of it had a lot of impact on me in regards to thinking about stories, because it's one of the most personal stories I've ever read. Because it involves this incredible intimate detail, not only about a person's life but their genealogy. And that just seems like such an interesting way for an artist to involve themselves in their work. Like, yeah, it could be egotistical, but he manages to do it in a way that it isn't egotistical at all. It's like he's really thinking hard about this one specific spot in the United Kingdom, because it's where, it's where his heart is, basically, and it comes through in the story. And it's also, I mean, that is part of the reason why I keep harping on this idea of like direct experience, because I want to see other people's interpretation of that idea. Like, I'd love to see other people make work that is, like, myself included, exclusively based in the space where they are living in that moment. You know,
it is that mantra, write what you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was a cool thing about Digits, was like I kind of got to see a bit of like your hometown, right? Even though I don't remember in the story if it was supposed to be explicitly in Connecticut. It was kind of wherever in the United States, right?
It was kind of ambiguous,
But knowing that it was shot there, and knowing that was like your friends and people that you know and cast that was from that area, it was like I got to see a part of that area of the United States that I wouldn't see any other time. And it's a really interesting fact, or an interesting aspect of a lot of films, is that a lot of films kind of take place in ambiguous like locales that are usually just some random place in Los Angeles or New York,
Yeah.
And our stories are an opportunity to talk about a locale, and doesn't mean all of them have to.
Or to create one. Some people, some storytellers and artists, they take the opportunity to make the setting a character. And those are the ones, like, again, I'm going to keep going on horror here, but when I say the words Camp Crystal Lake, everybody knows Jason Voorhees. You know what I mean? If I talk about Haddonfield, people talk about Michael Myers. I talk about Springwood, Freddy Krueger. Like, they take the opportunity to create those personalities of our characters of a setting. And most of them are actually places, and it's like, okay, I've read the IMDb trivia. I know it was shot in Illinois. I know it was shot in New Jersey, etc. Like, I am getting a taste of those things regardless, but it's that fusion of lived-in experiences and imagination. And that's, that's kind of our job, and I don't think anyone should ever fault an artist for being exuberant or bombastic with their tales, telling them a little taller than the rest of us. Just because that's kind of our thing. You know what I mean? We like to embellish and to kind of caricature things just because it's a stylistic choice. It makes it more interesting. It's important. It's what separates the life or art from the mundane. Sometimes movies will be like, oh no, this is just like real life. And I go back to that fucking amateur filmmaking 101 thing where every story starts with somebody waking up and hating their dead-end job in the office. That bullshit. Like, that's boring. I don't want to go to the movies to see that. I don't want to watch that. I want to read that. Give me something more. Give me something a little bit more. Give me a little bit of fun, livelihood to that. Some kind of meaning. And that's where it comes down to. So I think we've passed our 1 hour mark, but I wanted to end with one more thing because we're talking about the art of loss. And do you think it's important? This is our last topic, but do you think it's important for artists not to only find meaning or, insert some kind of theme or even ask a question, as I pointed out before about loss, but to also showcase it? Because I've had a couple of times when I've had stories that I've written and people were like, yeah, I don't know if I want to go watch this where the dog dies. And you know what I mean? Like people, artists will shy away from doing things like that because they know an audience doesn't necessarily want that. But at the same time, as an artist myself, again, I feel like you're not living that full life unless you've gone through a gauntlet of emotions every month. Like, you need to have, And I say this as a dude that I can't tell you the last time I cried. I think the last time I cried was when I first held my son back in December. But since then, it's been 4 or 5 months now, and I haven't cried. And it's like there's a human part deep down inside me that wants to engage, wants to shift into that gear.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's important to showcase those moments in art, that art, like loss and grief and all that kind of thing. But a lot of artists shy away from it because they know an audience doesn't go to a story for that.
Yeah,
so what's your 2 cents on that?
I was gonna say I imagine that's often the reason why artists shy away from it is explicitly because not because they don't want to do it, because they're worried that somebody might not enjoy it, because there is often a bias against downbeat.
There's a bias against any kind of beat. If you think about it, if you have a character that's jumping out of a plane, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people in the audience, a good majority of them are not going to go skydiving, but they do enjoy that vicarious feeling of the shots and the panoramic views and all this kind of stuff of falling and the wind blowing and the screaming and all that kind of excitement that goes with it. Right? That's not a downbeat. That's an upbeat. That's that thrill of adrenaline. And we talked about they don't want to, people can hit those beats of life and not feel any change and they feel okay. But I think deep down they're craving it. And I'm curious to know why you think people shy away from any of those beats. You know what I mean? Like the downbeats in particular, yes. But like the thing stays the same, is that the audience craves all of the beats. But for some reason, downbeats get the shaft.
It's shying away from having the feeling. I mean, I've definitely say having been in, having been through some pretty difficult parts in my life, there have been times where I'm like, I can't watch that movie.
You don't want to relive it.
I can't watch that movie tonight. I don't want to feel that way. Like,
yeah.
Like I have to be in the emotional state to deal with it. Where in the same way of like, music, where it's like, sometimes I want to listen to like sad and intensely emotional music.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm creating, but it really depends on where I am in the day. And it doesn't entirely, it's not like something I can rationally explain, like it's just like sometimes I'm like, oh, I feel like I want to listen to some fucking moody classical music from the Romantic period. Or like
the Radiohead cover of
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There are times when Radiohead is necessary, and then there are times where it's like I need Daft Punk today. I need something upbeat.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I do think I think it's a case to case basis. Some people respond really differently to an emotional state depending on where they are at in the day. And also I would wonder, I don't know, but I would wonder if it has to do with a given time period as well. Like I'm sure I don't know this for certain, but I'm sure somebody did like a study, looked into the history of it. There might be years or periods of time where movies that are more realistic and more emotionally intense did better than lighter movies. Like the 70s were a period of time that had a lot of emotionally intense, like harder in terms
gritty.
of in terms of like reality or whatever, where the comedy wasn't as good, or it was like sillier, and it didn't take off as much as like the grittier type movies. And the exact opposite, you go to like the late 80s and 90s, like stupid comedy movies really flowered during that time. And they're great, but that was the time for them. And I'm not enough of a historian to know why that was when it was. But I think, and I suspect that when people are going through harder times, they want two different flavors. I want something that reflects this exactly, and I want something that's the exact opposite.
Mm.
Like don't want to think about it right now.
Yeah, I don't want a
Like,
different problem to think about. I want to reflect in my own kind of thing. I get
I'm not
that.
gonna reflect on my own. I want something that's so alien from it that I can just not think about it at all.
Right, that escapism that we were talking about
Yeah.
before. Absolutely. So oddly enough, we've gone for an hour 20, and I was sitting here before we started recording, thinking, yeah, we'll get 45 minutes out of this topic. So we'll wrap up here. But I definitely think loss is something that an artist should not be so easy to shy away from. I think you might need to spring it on your audience. I think that's the actionable kind of thing that I will end with my recommendation with, is that I think you can't, it can't be in the previews of the coming attractions and this and that, that the dog is going to die. I think it's one of those things because a lot of times loss, as Mr. Rainwater will attest, will kind of drip in on you unexpectedly. And not to rub that in too hard, but with the word drip.
Pun intended or not? I'm not sure.
halfway into saying the word drip, I realized what I was doing, so it might have been, might not, I don't know. But the point is, as I think loss is important, and I think those feelings of loss and grief and mourning and all that kind of stuff, those are necessary. I think that's something that people should include in their art, whether it's music or comics or movies or books or whatever. Maybe it doesn't always have to be there, but you can use it. It's another tool in the toolbox, and I think it's one of the most universal, primal feelings that everybody goes through, and I almost feel like it's a responsibility of an artist to try to lend a helping hand to others who, you know what I mean? Maybe like right now, if you like, if someone in your life just, took their own life, it's not the right time for you to sit down and start writing a screenplay about depression. It's not. But when you've worked through it and you've found your truth in how to deal with it, then you do kind of have a responsibility. When you can reflect back, like Rainwater was talking about, standing outside of yourself and outside of time and viewing it from an objective point of view, I think you have a responsibility to put it into your art. It needs to be I cannot stress this point enough. It needs to be relevant to what you're doing. Because if you're hired to design a Campbell Soup label, do not start putting in symbolism for your grandparents passing away or something like that. Like that's not what I'm saying here, but like for personal works, or maybe it is. Maybe you're an advertising director shooting a commercial and you want to, pay homage to your grandpa who always made you chicken noodle soup or something like that. Maybe that's the comfort that somebody is seeking, or will resonate with someone. Who knows? But I guess the point is, loss is something to value.
Yes.
Maybe not chase after, but
yeah,
to value.
No, I would say loss is something to value, and the other thing that I was going to say is I think an artist has a responsibility to themselves to convert the loss in their life into art that goes beyond it, I guess, that transforms it or sublimates it. I guess that's the word that I'm looking for. I think that's all that I have to say in regards to that.
I think we've nailed it. And that's the end of our show, folks. We'll see you next week.